I'm Alicia Bailey. I've landed fighter jets on pitching carrier decks in the middle of ocean storms, and I currently run an aviation logistics fleet worth tens of millions of dollars. But to my father, Frank Bailey, a machinist who has spent his entire life worshipping hands stained with grease and oil, I am nothing more than a high-maintenance, unemployed woman. Last Friday night, at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in Springfield, a place that reeks of stale beer and old cigarettes, he pointed a calloused finger at me in front of his circle of old friends and sneered, "Gentlemen, let me introduce you to my daughter. She's still playing her little flying games while she waits to find a real job." Their raucous, wheezing laughter felt like daggers driven straight into my self-esteem. But that humiliation wasn't even the worst part. The worst part happened 48 hours later, at an altitude of 30,000 feet. It was the moment a crystal champagne flute fell, shattering into dust on the cabin floor. And along with that sound of breaking glass was the sound of my father's conservative ego collapsing forever. If you have ever spent your entire life striving just to receive a shake of the head and a denial from your own parents, leave a comment saying, "I've been there," and subscribe to the channel right now. This story is the vindication you have been waiting for. The smell hit me the moment I pushed open the heavy oak door of VFW Post 1031. It was a scent you only find in places like this in the Rust Belt of Ohio. A permanent layered cocktail of stale hops, floor wax, and the ghost of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the drywall decades before the indoor smoking bans. It was the smell of men who were tired. I adjusted the collar of my blazer. It was a charcoal Italian cut, sharp and professional. The kind of suit I wore to board meetings with investors. Here, under the flickering fluorescent lights and the neon glow of beer signs, it felt like a costume. I looked like an alien species invading a sanctuary of flannel shirts, faded Carhartt jackets, and baseball caps that had lost their shape years ago. The jukebox in the corner was playing something low and mournful. George Jones, I think. He stopped loving her today. Fitting. The atmosphere in Springfield hadn't changed much since the big assembly plant laid off the second shift 3 years ago. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for a suffocating death. I scanned the room and found him immediately. Frank Bailey, my father. He was holding court at a high-top round table near the bar, nursing a bottle of domestic beer. He looked older than the last time I saw him. His shoulders, once broad enough to carry engine blocks, were hunched forward. But his voice was loud, projecting that specific kind of boisterousness men use when they are trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that they still matter. 1,000 bolts a day, I heard him saying as I approached. Hand turned, precision within a millimeter. We didn't have these computer programs doing the work for us. We had eyes and hands. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was the Navy discipline kicking in. Assess the situation. Engage. "Hi, Dad," I said, stepping into the circle of light. The conversation at the table died instantly. 3 pairs of eyes shifted to me. There was old Miller, who used to work the furnaces, and a guy everyone called Rusty, whose real name I never knew. And then there was Frank. He didn't smile. He didn't stand up to hug me. He didn't ask how the drive was or how my business was doing. Instead, he looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my clean hands and my tailored suit with a mix of suspicion and disdain. He turned back to his friends, a smirk curling the corner of his mouth under his gray mustache. He gestured to me with his beer bottle, using me as a prop for his performance. "Speak of the devil," Frank announced, his voice booming unnecessarily loud. "Gentlemen, let me introduce you to my daughter, Alicia. Look at her, all dressed up like she's going to a funeral." The men chuckled, a low, dry sound. "She's back in town for a bit," Frank continued, winking at Rusty. "She's still playing her little flying games. You know how it is. Driving a taxi in the sky." My stomach tightened into a knot. Taxi in the sky. That's what he called Bailey Aero Logistics. That's what he called a company that specialized in high-priority medical transport and executive logistics. "Dad," I started, trying to keep my voice even. It's not a taxi service. We manage a fleet of… Whatever you say, honey. He cut me off, waving a hand dismissively. It's driving, just higher up. And with autopilot doing all the work, right? He looked around the table for validation, and he got it. Old Miller leaned back, scratching his chin. Must be nice, Miller wheezed, sitting in the air conditioning all day. Hey, little lady, you careful with those buttons. Don't want to break a nail, do ya? The table erupted in laughter. It wasn't friendly teasing. It was weaponized. It was the sound of men who felt the world had left them behind, deciding to tear down someone who represented the future they couldn't touch. Yeah, Rusty chimed in, pointing a grease-stained finger at me. My niece is looking for work. Maybe when you get tired of playing pilot, you can come back here. I think the Kroger down on Main Street needs a greeter. Or maybe a cashier. That's honest work, on your feet. Real interaction. She couldn't handle being on her feet all day, Frank said, shaking his head with mock pity. Alicia likes the soft life, always has. College, Navy officer's mess, now this corporate thing. My hand twitched toward the inside pocket of my blazer. Resting there, in a silver case, were my business cards. Alicia Bailey, CEO. I wanted to pull one out. I wanted to slam it on the sticky, beer-stained table. I wanted to scream, I employ 50 people. I own assets worth more than this entire city block. I have pulled 9 Gs in a fighter jet while you were asleep in your recliner. But I looked at their faces. I saw the deep lines etched around their eyes. I saw the fraying cuffs of their shirts. I saw the tremor in my father's hand as he lifted his beer, a tremor he was trying desperately to hide. If I pulled out that card, they wouldn't see success. They would see an insult. They would see fake work. To them, if you didn't come home with dirt under your fingernails and a backache that crippled you, you hadn't actually worked. My success was a mirror reflecting their obsolescence, and they were smashing the mirror to avoid looking at themselves. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow sadness. I slowly moved my hand away from my pocket. I'll get a drink, I said quietly. I walked to the bar and ordered a house red wine. The bartender poured it from a box. It tasted like vinegar and regret. I stood there for a moment, my back to my father, listening to him launch into another story about the good old days of 1995. His voice louder now that he had successfully put me in my place. I downed the wine in one long, burning swallow. It sat heavy in my stomach, acidic and vile. I didn't turn back to the table. I didn't say goodbye. I just placed the empty glass on the bar and walked out. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of the jukebox and the laughter. The night air in Springfield was freezing, biting at my exposed neck. The parking lot was dark, illuminated only by a single flickering street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I walked toward my rental car, my heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. A sharp, solitary sound in the empty night. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against my back. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I could still hear his voice in my head. Playing games, taxi in the sky. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried over Frank Bailey since I was 12 years old. Instead, I started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a modern digital glow in the darkness. I shifted into gear and drove away from the VFW, heading toward my parents' house for a dinner I was dreading more than combat. But as the tires hummed against the road, I realized the silence in the car was louder than the noise I had just left. It was the silence of things unsaid, and a gap between father and daughter that had just widened into a canyon. The drive from the VFW to my parents' house was only 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing a border between two hostile nations. By the time I pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of the small ranch-style house I grew up in, my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roasted onions and ground beef. It was the smell of my childhood. Meatloaf night. My mother, Mary, was at the stove, wiping her hands on a floral apron that looked as if it had been bought in the 80s. She offered me a tight, nervous smile as I walked in. She knew. In a small town like Springfield, news travels faster than light. She probably knew about the scene at the bar before I'd even started my car. Wash up, she said, her voice overly cheerful, trying to compensate for the silence that was about to swallow us whole. It's ready. We sat at the small kitchen table. It was the same table where I had done my homework, where I had filled out my Navy application, and where I had told them I was leaving. Nothing had changed. The wood paneling on the walls was still peeling slightly at the corners. The fluorescent overhead light still hummed with a low, irritating buzz. Dinner was served. A thick slab of meatloaf glazed with ketchup, a scoop of mashed potatoes that looked heavy enough to be used as mortar, and canned green beans. It was the classic American comfort food, hearty, cheap, and filling. It was the fuel of the working class. But tonight, as I picked up my fork, it looked like gray sludge. For the first 5 minutes, the only sound was the scraping of silverware against ceramic plates. Scrape, clink, chew. It was a rhythm of tension. So, my mother started, her eyes darting between Frank and me. How is the company, Alicia? You said you hired some new people? I swallowed a bite of potato that felt like dry clay in my throat. It's going well, Mom. We just secured a new contract for organ transport in the tri-state area. It means we have to be on call 24/7, but it's vital work. I looked at my father. He was staring at his meatloaf, cutting it with surgical precision. He didn't look up. A contract? Frank grunted. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Yes, I said. It's a big step for us. Frank finally looked up. His eyes were hard, devoid of the warmth a father's eyes should have. So, this company of yours, does it have a shop? A floor? Or is it just a bunch of computers in a rented office? We have a hangar, Dad, I explained, trying to keep the defensive edge out of my voice. And yes, we use computers. That's how logistics works. We track weather patterns, flight paths, fuel consumption. Logistics. He spat the word out like it tasted bad. That's a fancy word for moving stuff. You're a delivery service, a glorified shipper. It's not shipping packages, Frank, my mother interjected softly, but he silenced her with a wave of his fork. It is what it is, Mary, he said, turning his full attention to me. I spent 40 years at the plant. When I finished a shift, I could point to something. I could hold a steel mold in my hand and say, I made that. That mold is going to be there for 50 years, maybe 100. It's solid. It's real. He leaned forward, pointing his knife at me. What do you make, Alicia? You fly a plane from point A to point B, then you land. And then what? It's gone. The work is gone. It disappears into thin air. You don't build anything. You don't fix anything. You just float. I transport medical teams, I said, my voice rising slightly. I transport organs that save lives. Last month we flew a liver to Cleveland in a blizzard because the helicopters were grounded. A man is alive today because of my floating. Frank rolled his eyes, taking a large bite of meatloaf. There you go again, dramatics. Always with the dramatics. He chewed slowly, deliberately. Then he gestured toward the window, toward the house next door. You know who you should talk to while you're here? Jimmy. The Johnson kid. My stomach turned. Jimmy Johnson used to eat paste in the 2nd grade. Why would I talk to Jimmy? I asked. He's doing well for himself, Frank said, a note of genuine admiration creeping into his voice, a tone he never used with me. He's a plumber now, got his own van, painted it himself. Johnson and Sons Plumbing. I saw him yesterday, backed into his driveway. He was covered in muck, hands black as coal, sweat pouring down his face. Frank smiled. It was a cruel, satisfied smile. Now that is a man who works. That is honest labor. He fixes things people actually need. He doesn't need a computer to tell him a pipe is leaking. He uses his hands. He's got stability. The comparison hung in the air like smoke. Jimmy, the plumber with the dirty van, was the hero. I, the CEO piloting a $13 million Learjet 75 Liberty, was the failure. Because my hands were clean. I looked down at my hands resting on the cheap tablecloth. They were steady. My fingernails were trimmed short, practical, and clean. These were the hands that knew how to manipulate the yoke of a high-performance aircraft through wind shear. These were the hands that signed paychecks for 50 employees. These were the hands that held the lives of strangers in their palms every time I engaged the thrusters. But to Frank Bailey, they were soft. They were useless. They were the hands of a child playing pretend. "Stability isn't about dirt, Dad," I whispered. "Stability is having a trade," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "If the internet crashes tomorrow, what are you going to do? Jimmy can still fix a toilet. You're obsolete without a screen." The silence returned, heavier than before. My mother looked down at her plate, defeated. I felt a stinging sensation behind my eyes, but I refused to blink. If you have ever felt like your achievements were invisible to the people who were supposed to be proud of you, I want you to pause right here. Hit that like button and comment, "I am enough," below. Do it for yourself. Because we all need to be reminded that our worth isn't defined by someone else's limited view. I looked at the meatloaf on my plate. I couldn't eat another bite. The comfort food felt like a lie. There was no comfort here. There was only a rigid, rusting definition of value that I would never fit into. Frank went back to eating, satisfied that he had won the argument, satisfied that he had reminded me of my place in his hierarchy. He didn't see the pilot, he didn't see the CEO. He just saw a little girl who refused to get her hands dirty. "I'm not hungry," I said, pushing my chair back. "Sit down," Frank said, not looking up. "We finished dinner as a family." "I'm full," I lied. "You're running away," he corrected, "just like you always do when things get real." "Go ahead, go back to your room and play with your phone. Let the adults finish the meal." I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, it was rage. A cold, quiet rage that was beginning to harden in my chest. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the smell of meatloaf and the sound of his chewing behind me. As I walked down the hallway toward my old bedroom, his question from earlier echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of the house that no longer felt like home. "When are you going to get a real job? When are you going to be stable?" The question swirled in my head, mocking me. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was all a house of cards. Maybe I was just playing dress-up in a pilot's uniform. I needed to see something real. I needed to remember who I was before I became Frank's disappointment. I reached for the doorknob of my childhood bedroom, desperate for a sanctuary, but dreading what I might find inside. The door to my childhood bedroom creaked as I pushed it open, a sound that instantly transported me back 20 years. The room smelled of lavender detergent and stale dust. The scent of a space that is cleaned regularly but never lived in. I flipped the switch, and the yellow light from the ceiling fan flooded the room. It was a time capsule. My high school diploma was still framed on the wall. A faded poster of a generic rock band from the late 90s was pinned above the dresser. The bed was made with military precision, the corners tucked tight, likely my mother's doing. But something was wrong. I looked at the long wooden shelf above the desk. For years, that shelf had been my sanctuary. It was where I displayed them: the P-51 Mustang, the F-14 Tomcat, the SR-71 Blackbird. I had spent hundreds of hours in this room, hunched over those plastic kits, my fingers sticky with glue, carefully painting the fuselage details with a single hair brush. They weren't just models. They were the first physical manifestations of my dream. They were my escape plan. The shelf was empty, my heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. There, pushed into the far corner amongst dust bunnies, was a beat-up cardboard box. I dragged it out. On the side, written in black Sharpie in my father's blocky, aggressive handwriting, were 2 words: "Old toys." I opened the flaps. Inside, my fleet was a ruin. The F-14, the one I had spent 3 weeks painting to match the squadron from Top Gun, was lying on its side, one wing snapped clean off. The landing gear of the Blackbird was crushed. They had been thrown in there carelessly, tossed aside like garbage to make room for... what? For emptiness? "Old toys," I whispered, picking up the broken Tomcat. The plastic felt cold and brittle. To Frank Bailey, that's all they were: childish distractions. To him, my career was just an extension of this box. A prolonged game of make-believe that I refused to grow out of. A memory washed over me, sharp and blindingly bright. It was May in Annapolis, Maryland. Graduation day at the United States Naval Academy. The air was thick with humidity and the electric energy of 1,000 midshipmen about to become officers. The stadium was a sea of dress whites. I remembered standing in formation, sweat trickling down my back, my chest swelling with a pride so intense it felt like it might crack my ribs. I scanned the stands for my parents. I found my mother easily. She was waving a small American flag, wiping tears from her eyes. But the seat next to her was empty. I remembered the phone call the night before. "I can't make it, Allie," Frank had said, his voice flat. "Mr. Henderson brought his Buick in. Carburetor is shot. He needs it by Monday. It's a big job." A carburetor. My commissioning as an officer in the United States Navy, the culmination of 4 years of blood, sweat, and calculus, was less important than a carburetor on a 1985 Buick. I had swallowed the hurt then, just as I was swallowing it now. I had told myself he was just practical. He was a working man. He couldn't afford to lose a client. But looking at the box of broken planes, I knew the truth. He didn't miss my graduation because of a car. He missed it because he couldn't bear to see me succeed in a world he didn't understand. If he came, he would have to admit that I was something more than just a machinist's daughter. He would have to salute me. And Frank Bailey would rather die than salute his own child. I stood up, dusting off my knees. I walked over to the desk. The same desk where I used to study for my SATs until 2 in the morning. I pulled open the top drawer. It was the junk drawer. Every American household has one. Old batteries, dried-out pens, rubber bands, and paper clips. And there, shoved to the back, buried under a stack of expired coupons, was a small, rectangular case. My breath hitched. I reached in and pulled it out. The velvet was gathering dust. I clicked it open. Inside lay the Meritorious Service Medal. I had mailed this to them last year. It was awarded to me for my role in coordinating a massive logistics operation during a humanitarian crisis in the Pacific. It was one of the highest honors of my career. I had sent it with a note. "Thought you might want to put this on the mantle. Love, Allie." It hadn't made it to the mantle. It hadn't even made it to the wall. It had been tossed in the junk drawer, treated with the same reverence as a dead AA battery. I ran my thumb over the ribbon. The metal was cool and heavy. "They don't understand," I said aloud to the empty room. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." I looked at the mirror hanging on the back of the door. The woman staring back at me looked tired. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked like a daughter who was desperate for her daddy to tell her she did a good job. I hated her. I thought of Admiral William McRaven. Every Navy officer knows his speech. I wasn't a SEAL, but the ethos was drilled into us all the same. If you want to change the world, don't ever, ever ring the bell. In SEAL training, there is a brass bell hanging in the center of the compound. All you have to do to quit is ring the bell. Ring the bell and you don't have to wake up at 4 a.m. Ring the bell and you don't have to endure the freezing cold. Ring the bell and the pain stops. Frank wanted me to ring the bell. He wanted me to quit. He wanted me to admit that flying was too hard, that the business was too stressful, that I was just a girl playing with toys. He wanted me to come home, put on a Kroger vest, and say, "You were right, Dad. The world is too big for me." If I did that, he would love me again. He would hug me. We would eat meatloaf, and he would tell me how to fix a leaky faucet, and we would be a happy, miserable family. I looked down at the metal again. I pulled the sleeve of my blouse down and wiped a smudge of dust from the gold surface until it gleamed under the yellow light. I am not that girl. I didn't survive G-Force training to be taken down by a passive-aggressive dinner conversation. I didn't navigate storms over the Atlantic to be grounded by a man who hasn't left Ohio in 20 years. I took the medal out of the case. I didn't pin it on. I didn't need to wear it. I just set it on top of the desk, right in the center where the light hit it. I wasn't doing this for him anymore. That was the mistake I had made for 34 years. I'd been flying to get his attention. Tomorrow at the airfield, I wouldn't be Frank Bailey's daughter seeking approval. I walked over to the bed and sat down, pulling out my phone to check the flight plan for tomorrow. The weather over Springfield was clearing up, but there was turbulence expected near the coast. I scrolled through the manifest. Passenger, General Jenner Robert Ellison. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, sterile air of the room fill my lungs. The sadness was still there, a dull ache in the center of my chest, but the desperation was gone. It had been replaced by something colder, something harder. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. No ringing the bell, I whispered into the dark. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, two worlds were going to collide on that tarmac. And I made a silent vow that when the dust settled, I would be the one still standing. The suspension of my father's 1998 Ford F-150 groaned in protest as we hit a pothole on the access road leading to the regional airfield. The truck smelled of stale coffee, old vinyl, and that specific metallic scent of raw gasoline that seems to permeate every vehicle from the late 90s that has seen too many winters. Frank wrestled the steering wheel with one hand, his other arm resting on the open window frame, the morning wind whipping his thinning gray hair. The muffler was shot, resulting in a low, throaty rumble that made conversation difficult, which was fine by me. We hadn't spoken much since he picked me up. "Gas is up another 10 cents, Frank shouted over the engine noise, narrowing his eyes at a passing station. "Robbery, that's what it is. I remember when you could fill this tank for $20. Now? You need a loan just to get to the grocery store." I nodded, staring out the window at the familiar landscape of Springfield. Flat fields, rusted chain-link fences, and the skeletons of abandoned warehouses passed by in a blur of gray and brown. "And this private airfield," he continued, not waiting for a response. "Why do you need to fly out of here? The commercial airport is perfectly fine, probably cheaper too." "But no, you have to do the fancy thing. You have to be separate from the regular folks." "It's not about being fancy, Dad," I said, my voice tired. "It's about logistics. We need hangar space for maintenance, and the commercial slots are too restrictive for our schedule. Plus, the general prefers discretion." "The general," Frank scoffed, tapping his fingers against the cracked steering wheel. "Right, the VIP, probably some desk jockey who likes to feel important." He turned the truck onto the tarmac access road, flashing his old ID at the gate guard who waved us through with a bored expression. The truck rattled over the transition from asphalt to the smooth concrete of the apron. And then we saw it. Parked in front of Hangar 4, bathed in the early morning sunlight, was the Learjet 75 Liberty. It looked like a predator resting between hunts. The fuselage was a brilliant, blinding white, with a sleek navy blue stripe running from the nose to the tail, tapering off like a blade. The wings were swept back aggressively, tipped with winglets that sliced through the air even when stationary. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a sculpture of speed and money. It was a $13 million masterpiece of aerospace engineering, and it was mine. I felt a surge of pride swell in my chest, a feeling that usually grounded me. But today, glancing at the man beside me, that pride was instantly laced with anxiety. Frank slammed on the brakes. The F-150 lurched to a halt about 50 feet from the jet. The silence that followed the engine cutting out was deafening. The contrast was violent. The rusted, dented work truck dripping oil onto the pristine concrete, sitting in the shadow of a jet that represented the pinnacle of modern aviation. Frank didn't say a word. He just stared. I opened my door and stepped out, the cool morning air filling my lungs. "Well," I said, trying to sound casual. "There she is." Frank opened his door slowly. The hinges creaked, a sharp, rusty sound that echoed across the tarmac. He stepped down, his work boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He adjusted his trucker hat and walked toward the plane, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jeans. He didn't look at me. He walked right up to the nose of the jet. I watched him, holding my breath, hoping for just one word: beautiful, impressive. "Good job, Allie." Instead, Frank reached out and rapped his knuckles against the fuselage. Thump, thump. "Composite," he muttered. It sounded like a curse word. He walked around to the landing gear, squatting down to inspect the tires. He kicked the front strut with the toe of his boot. Not a gentle tap, but a solid kick. The way a man tests the durability of a used tractor he's suspicious of buying. "It's too shiny," Frank announced, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans as if the cleanliness of the plane had offended him. "Looks like a toy. Back in the day, planes were made of riveted steel. You could feel the weight of them. This? This feels like plastic." "It's carbon fiber and aluminum alloy, Dad," I corrected him, fighting the urge to cross my arms. "It's lighter, stronger, and more fuel-efficient than steel. It's designed to withstand forces that would tear a real steel plane apart." Frank sniffed, unimpressed. "If you say so, just looks flimsy to me. Like if you hit a bird, the whole thing would shatter like an eggshell. Give me good old American iron any day." He was doing it again. He was finding flaws where there were none, because admitting the perfection of the machine would mean admitting the success of the woman who owned it. He felt small standing next to the engines, so he had to make the plane feel small. Just then, the cabin door opened and the stairs unfolded automatically with a soft hydraulic whir. Luis, my first officer, descended the steps. Luis was impeccable. His white shirt was pressed crisp, his black tie perfectly knotted, and the 3 gold bars on his epaulettes caught the sun. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who spent his life in the cockpit. He spotted me and immediately straightened his posture. "Good morning, Captain," Luis called out, his voice projecting clearly across the distance. He walked over to us, ignoring Frank's dirty truck, and extended a hand to take my flight bag. "We are fully fueled, flight plan is filed, and the cabin is prepped. Coffee is brewing just how you like it." I saw Frank flinch. The word captain hit him harder than the sight of the plane. Frank looked at Luis, then at me, and then let out a short, derisive laugh. He shook his head, looking at the ground. "Captain," Frank repeated, rolling the word around in his mouth like it was a piece of gristle. He looked at Luis with a smirk. "You don't have to do that, son." Luis paused, confused. "Sir?" "The whole captain thing," Frank said, gesturing vaguely at me. "She's my daughter. You don't have to act so stiff." "It's a little much, isn't it? A little theatrical? You act like she's actually commanding a battleship." Luis's smile faded. He looked at me, then back at Frank, his expression hardening into professional coldness. "She is the pilot in command, sir. She signs the flight logs. She makes the decisions. Captain isn't an act. It's her rank." Frank waved his hand dismissively. Yeah, rank, sure. Just saying, relax a little. It's just a flying taxi ride." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "Dad, please," I said, my voice low. "Luis is a professional. Treat him like one." "I'm just being real, Alicia." Frank threw his hands up, feigning innocence. "Everyone takes themselves so seriously these days. Back at the plant, we called the foreman boss, but we winked when we said it. We knew who really did the work." He was about to launch into another lecture about the hierarchy of labor, about how managers were useless and workers were kings, when a sound cut through the air. It was the low, aggressive hum of precision-tuned engines approaching from the access road. We all turned. A convoy of 3 black Cadillac Escalades was gliding onto the tarmac. They moved in perfect formation, their windows tinted pitch black. They didn't rattle like Frank's truck. They didn't bounce over potholes. They moved with the heavy, undeniable authority of the federal government. Frank's mouth snapped shut. He took a half step back, instinctively moving closer to his rusted truck, as if seeking cover. The lead SUV stopped 20 yards from the jet. The doors opened in unison. Men in dark suits with earpieces stepped out, scanning the perimeter. "What is this?" Frank whispered, his voice suddenly stripped of its bravado. "Who is that?" I straightened my blazer, adjusting my cuffs. I looked at my father, whose eyes were wide with a sudden, dawning realization that he was out of his depth. "That," I said, picking up my flight bag before Luis could take it, "is my client, and we have work to do." The lead Cadillac Escalade came to a halt, with a precision that suggested the driver had done this 1,000 times in war zones and capital cities alike. The engine cut, and for a split second, the only sound on the tarmac was the wind whistling through the gap between Frank's rusted truck and my gleaming jet. Then the doors opened. 4 men in dark suits emerged from the front and rear vehicles. They moved with fluid, coiled energy, their eyes scanning the perimeter, the hangar roof, and finally resting on Frank and his truck with professional suspicion. They were the kind of men who didn't smile. Private security contractors, likely former special forces, hired to protect high-value assets. From the middle vehicle, a man stepped out. General Robert Ellison was a legend in the aviation community. Even out of uniform, wearing a charcoal civil suit that probably cost more than Frank's house, he carried the weight of 4 stars on his shoulders. He was in his 60s, with iron-gray hair cut high and tight, and a posture so erect he made the rest of us look like we were slouching. On his lapel, a small discreet pin of the American flag caught the morning light. My body reacted before my brain did. It was muscle memory burned into me during plebe summer at the Naval Academy. I snapped my heels together, straightened my spine, and brought my right hand up in a crisp, sharp salute. "General Ellison," I said, my voice steady, projecting over the tarmac. "Welcome aboard, sir." The general stopped. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, a look of recognition and respect. He returned a modified civilian version of the salute, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "At ease, Captain Bailey," he said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded attention without needing to shout. "Good to see you again. I trust the bird is ready to fly?" "She is, sir. Flight plan is filed for Teterboro. We're ready for immediate departure." It was a perfect professional exchange, clean, respectful, efficient. It was the language of my world. And then Frank Bailey decided to speak. My father pushed past me. He didn't walk around. He physically brushed my shoulder aside, stepping into the space between me and the general. He hitched up his jeans, his thumbs hooked into his belt loops for a second before thrusting his right hand forward. My heart stopped. I looked at Frank's hand. It was the same hand that had just kicked the landing gear tires. The palm was smeared with brake dust and black grease from the underside of his truck. He hadn't wiped it. He hadn't even tried. In Frank's mind, dirt was a badge of honor, proof that he was a real man amidst a sea of suit-wearing pretenders. "Howdy," Frank boomed, his voice gratingly loud against the professional quiet of the security detail. "I'm Frank Bailey. I'm the father." General Ellison paused. He looked at the extended hand, the grease clearly visible against Frank's calloused skin. Then, he looked up at Frank's face. To his credit, the general didn't recoil. He was a man who had shaken hands with warlords and presidents. A machinist from Ohio wasn't going to rattle him. "Mr. Bailey," the general said, taking Frank's hand. The handshake was brief, firm, and terminated quickly by the general. "Pleasure." Frank didn't let go of the moment, though. He leaned in, a conspiratorial grin stretching beneath his mustache. He treated this 4-star general like a buddy he'd just met at the hardware store. "So, you're the VIP, huh?" Frank chuckled, jerking his thumb back toward me. "Well, good luck up there. I hope she doesn't drive this thing into a cloud bank. She can be a little absent-minded, if you know what I mean." The air on the tarmac seemed to vanish. I stood frozen. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Luis, standing by the stairs of the jet, dropped his jaw slightly, his eyes darting between me and Frank in horror. Even the security detail shifted their stance, sensing the sudden spike in social tension. Frank was doing it. He was doing the thing he always did at family barbecues, but now he was doing it in front of one of the most powerful men in the American military. He was dismantling my competence to make himself feel bigger. General Ellison didn't smile. He slowly withdrew his hand and clasped it behind his back, his posture stiffening. The warmth in his eyes evaporated, replaced by the steel gaze that had stared down adversaries in the Situation Room. "Absent-minded?" the general repeated, his tone flat and dangerous. "Oh, you know," Frank laughed, oblivious to the temperature drop. Head in the clouds, always dreaming, not paying attention to the nuts and bolts. General Ellison turned his head slowly to look at me, then back to Frank. "Mr. Bailey." The general said, his voice icy. I have flown with the best pilots in the Air Force and the Navy. I have trusted my life to aces and test pilots. And I can tell you, without hesitation, that your daughter runs the tightest, safest flight deck I have ever stepped foot on. That is why I hired her. That is why I am here. It was a defense so absolute, so authoritative, that it should have ended the conversation. It was a direct validation from the highest level. But Frank Bailey couldn't accept it. To accept that I was a disciplined, elite professional would be to admit that his narrative of me, the flighty, useless daughter, was a lie. And Frank lived inside that lie. Frank let out a dismissive snort, waving his greasy hand in the air. He stepped closer to the general, and then, in a move that made the security agents take a step forward, he reached out and patted the general on the shoulder. "Aw, hell, General," Frank said, shaking his head with a pitying smile. "She's got you fooled too. That's just the training talking. You didn't know her when she was 12. Frank looked around at the security detail, trying to bring them in on the joke. 12 years old, Frank shouted, as if telling a hilarious anecdote at a bar. She had this red Schwinn bicycle, prided herself on it, and one day she loses the key to the chain lock. Just loses it. Cried for 3 hours. I had to get the bolt cutters and snap the chain myself because she was too busy crying to fix the problem." Frank looked back at the general, his eyes gleaming with a toxic mix of triumph and insecurity. "So you see, she panics, she loses things, just keep an eye on her up there. Make sure she doesn't lose the keys to the plane, all right?" Frank laughed again, a harsh, lonely sound that echoed off the metal hangar walls. I wanted to die. I physically wanted the concrete beneath my feet to open up and swallow me whole. He was using a childhood mistake, a lost bicycle key from 22 years ago, to invalidate my entire career, my rank, and my company, right in front of my most important client. General Ellison didn't laugh. He looked at the spot on his shoulder where Frank had touched him. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and deliberately wiped his hand where Frank's grease had stained it. He didn't look at Frank again. He looked at me. "Captain Bailey," the general said, his voice cutting through Frank's laughter like a razor blade, "we are burning daylight. Let's get wheels up." "Yes, sir," I whispered, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. The general turned on his heel and walked toward the stairs, Louise snapping to attention as he passed. The security detail followed, flowing around Frank like water around a stone, ignoring his existence entirely. Frank stood there, his smile faltering slightly as he realized no one was laughing with him. He realized he had been dismissed, not just as a nuisance, but as something irrelevant. The general walked up the stairs and disappeared into the cabin. I moved to follow him, desperate to get into the cockpit, desperate to put 30,000 feet between me and the man standing by the rusted truck. But before I could reach the stairs, a hand shot out and grabbed my arm. It wasn't a gentle grip. It was hard, possessive, and angry. I stopped and turned. Frank was glaring at me. The jovial, good old boy mask was gone. In its place was the face of a man who had just felt small and needed to make someone else feel smaller. He pulled me closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and bitterness. The gap between us closed, and the real confrontation was about to begin. The silence that descended on the tarmac after General Ellison disappeared inside the cabin was heavy, vibrating with the heat rising off the concrete. The security detail had melted into the background, professional shadows lingering near the SUVs, leaving me alone in the space between the rusted Ford F-150 and the pristine Learjet. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of managing the social disaster my father had just orchestrated. I needed to get into the cockpit. I needed the checklist. I needed the routine. I turned toward the stairs, my flight bag heavy on my shoulder. "Hey!" It wasn't a call, it was a command. Before I could take a step, a hand clamped down on my upper arm. It wasn't a gentle touch, it was a vice grip, the fingers digging into my bicep through the fabric of my blazer. It was the grip of a man who felt control slipping through his fingers and was desperate to crush it back into submission. I stopped. I didn't pull away immediately. I turned my head slowly to look at him. Frank had pulled me in close, invading my personal space. The jovial, loud-mouthed character he had played for the general was gone. In its place was something darker, something ugly and familiar. He was leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath and the metallic tang of old coins and grease that always clung to him. He looked around quickly to make sure the security agents were out of earshot. When he spoke, his voice was a low, guttural whisper, trembling with suppressed fury. "Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you," he hissed. "We have to go, Dad," I said, my voice flat. "The general is waiting." "The general?" Frank mocked, his face twisting into a sneer. He squeezed my arm harder, enough to bruise. "You think you're really something, don't you? Standing there saluting, acting like you run the show." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Let me tell you something, little girl. Don't think you can fool me with this charade. I know you rented this plane. I know you hired that actor in the pilot's uniform to open the door for you." I stared at him, blinking slowly. The accusation was so absurd, so detached from reality, that it took a moment to process. He actually believed it. He believed I had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar hoax just to trick him. Because in his mind, that was more plausible than his daughter actually being successful. "It's not a rental, Dad," I whispered. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, shaking my arm. "I know you, Alicia. I know who you are. You're the girl who cries when she loses a bicycle key. You're the girl who quits. You're soft." He released my arm with a shove, as if touching me disgusted him. He stabbed a finger toward my chest. "You are a disappointment," he said. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. "You've always been a disappointment. Playing dress-up in a pilot's costume doesn't change that. You still can't do anything right. You can't stick to a real job. You can't build a real life." He took a breath, straightening his trucker hat, his eyes cold and hard. "Just do me a favor," he muttered, turning his head to spit on the concrete. "Don't embarrass me further. Just fly the damn plane and try not to crash it. I don't need my friends at the VFW asking why my daughter killed a 4-star general because she was daydreaming." Time seemed to slow down. The wind died. The distant hum of the highway faded. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the echo of that last sentence. Don't embarrass me further. He had humiliated me. He had insulted a client. He had disrespected my staff. And yet, in his twisted, narcissistic reality, I was the one embarrassing him. I looked at Frank Bailey, really looked at him. For 34 years, I'd looked at him and seen a giant. I had seen the arbiter of my worth. I had seen the man whose approval I needed to breathe. But today, under the harsh morning sun of the airfield, the giant shrank. I saw the fraying collar of his flannel shirt. I saw the fear in his eyes, the terrified insecurity of a man who realized the world had moved on without him. And the only way he knew how to cope was to destroy the person who represented that change. He wasn't a giant. He was just a bitter old man standing next to a rusted truck. Something inside me clicked. It was a quiet, sharp sound, like a breaker switch flipping in a fuse box. The little girl who wanted her daddy to come to her graduation died. The daughter who ate the meatloaf and swallowed the insults died. In her place, the captain took over. My posture shifted. My shoulders squared. The softness in my eyes hardened into the steel gaze that had stared down storms over the Atlantic. I reached out and brushed the sleeve of my blazer where he had grabbed me, dusting off an invisible speck of dirt. It was a deliberate, dismissive motion. I looked him dead in the eye. "Get on the plane, Mr. Bailey," I said. Frank blinked. He looked confused, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What did you call me?" "You are a passenger on my aircraft," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was professional. It was ice. "The flight manifest is closed. We are wheels up in 5 minutes. If you are not on board, I will leave you on the tarmac." "You wouldn't dare," Frank sputtered, his face reddening. "I'm your father." "This flight waits for no one," I repeated, turning my back on him. I didn't wait for a response. I walked toward the stairs of the Learjet. I didn't stomp. I didn't run. I walked with the measured, rhythmic stride of a woman who owns the ground she walks on. I heard him sputtering behind me, muttering curses, but I didn't stop. I walked up the stairs, my heels ringing on the metal. Inside the cabin, General Ellison was already strapped into his seat, reviewing a file. He looked up as I entered. He saw my face. He saw the shift. He gave me a single, sharp nod. He knew. I didn't say a word. I walked past the galley, past the luxury leather seats, and approached the cockpit. This is the moment. If you have ever had to make the heartbreaking decision to fire a parent from the job of judging your life, if you have ever had to build a wall just to keep your sanity intact, hit that like button right now. Comment, "I chose me" below so we know you're part of this squad. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but sometimes it's the only way to survive. I stepped into the flight deck. It was a sanctuary of switches, screens, and logic. Here, there were no opinions. There was only physics: thrust, drag, lift, weight. If you followed the rules, you flew. If you didn't, you fell. It was fair. Unlike my father. Luis was already in the right seat, running the pre-start checklist. He looked at me with concern. "Captain?" he asked softly. "Are we good?" I sat in the left seat, the command seat. I buckled the 5-point harness, the straps crossing over my chest like armor. I reached up and adjusted my headset, the noise-canceling cups sealing out the world outside. I looked out the side window. I saw Frank slowly walking up the stairs, looking small, defeated, and angry. I turned to the center console. I reached for the handle of the cockpit door. I pulled it shut. Click. The sound of the latch engaging was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a vault closing. It was the sound of a boundary being set in stone. I turned to Luis. My face was a mask of absolute focus. "Door is secured," I said, my voice steady and clear over the intercom. "Let's start number 1. I reached for the starter switch. The engine began to whine, a high-pitched scream that grew into a roar, drowning out everything else. I wasn't Frank Bailey's daughter anymore. I was the pilot in command, and I was ready to leave the ground. At 41,000 feet, the sky is a different color. It's not the soft, welcoming blue you see from the ground. It's a deep, bruised purple, fading into the infinite black of space. Up here, the air is too thin to breathe, and the temperature is 50 degrees below zero. The only thing keeping you alive is a pressurized aluminum and composite tube and the person flying it. I sat in the left seat of the cockpit, my hands resting lightly on the yoke. The flight was smooth enough to balance a nickel on its edge. The Honeywell engines were humming their steady, high-pitched hymn of power. I should have been enjoying the silence. I should have been focused solely on the instruments. But I had the cabin intercom toggled on. It's standard procedure for VIP flights. You need to know if the client needs anything, or if there's a medical emergency. But today, it was a curse. Through my noise-canceling headset, I didn't just hear the ambient hiss of the air conditioning. I heard the dismantling of my character, broadcast live in high definition. "Sour stuff," Frank's voice crackled over the headset. I could hear the wet thud of a heavy crystal glass being set down too hard on the bird's eye maple table. "Tastes like vinegar and old grapes. You pay money for this?" I winced. That sour stuff was a bottle of Camus Special Selection Cabernet, a vintage that cost more than my father's monthly pension check. "It is generally considered an excellent vintage, Mr. Bailey," General Ellison's voice replied. It was calm, polite, but I could hear the edge of strain in it. "Humph," Frank grunted. "Give me a cold draft at the VFW any day. A Pabst Blue Ribbon. That's an honest drink." This is just show. Like everything else in this flying tin can. I stared at the horizon, my grip tightening on the yoke. I could picture him back there. He would be slouching in the hand-stitched leather seat, looking out of place in his flannel shirt, likely holding the delicate wine glass by the bowl with his whole fist, leaving greasy prints on the crystal. "It's comfortable, I'll give you that," Frank continued, his voice taking on that preaching tone I knew so well. the tone that meant a lecture was coming. But don't let the leather fool you, General. It's a soft world up here. A soft world for soft people. Soft? The General asked. Yeah. Soft, Frank said, the sound of him pouring more wine filling the silence. You know, back in my day, work meant something. It meant you came home with a backache. It meant your knuckles were busted and bleeding because a wrench slipped. It meant you built something you could touch. I checked the airspeed. Mach 0.78. We were tearing through the atmosphere at nearly 600 miles per hour. Take my daughter, for instance, Frank said, and my stomach dropped. She thinks she's doing big work, walking around in that suit, calling herself captain. But look at her. She sits in an air-conditioned box, pushing a few buttons, watching screens. It's a video game, that's all it is. A glorified video game. Is that so? The General's voice was cooler now, dropping a few degrees. Absolutely, Frank insisted, warming up to his favorite subject. These kids today, they don't know the value of sweat equity. If you don't sweat, you don't deserve the glory. They want the title, they want the money, but they don't want the grime. Alicia. She's always been afraid of the grime. She ran away to the Navy just to avoid getting a real job in the real world. I felt Luis, my co-pilot, shift in his seat next to me. He was looking at me, his eyes wide. He could hear it too. He reached out as if to mute the audio, to spare me the pain, but I shook my head. I needed to hear this. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. Mr. Bailey, General Ellison interrupted. The politeness was evaporating, replaced by the authority of a man who had commanded carrier strike groups. With all due respect, you are mistaken. Mistaken? Frank laughed, a short, sharp bark. I raised her. I know what she is. You know who she was as a child, the General corrected. You do not know who she is as a professional. Do you have any idea what it takes to sit in that seat forward of us? Sure, Frank scoffed. A few classes, some simulator time, memorizing a manual. It takes passing a physical exam that would disqualify 90% of the population, the General said, his voice rising in intensity. It takes mastering aerodynamics, meteorology, and physics. It takes the ability to make life or death decisions in a nanosecond while your body is being crushed by G-forces that would make an average man pass out and vomit on himself. There was a pause. I held my breath. Alicia isn't just pushing buttons, Mr. Bailey. The General continued, his tone cutting like a scalpel. She is managing kinetic energy. She is calculating fuel burn against headwinds to ensure we don't drop out of the sky over the Atlantic. She's listening to 3 different radio frequencies simultaneously while navigating complex airspace. That isn't a video game. That is lethal responsibility. And she bears that weight every single time she releases the brakes. I felt a tear, hot and sudden, prick the corner of my eye. I blinked it away furiously. To hear a stranger, a client, defend me with such ferocity while my own father sat there tearing me down. It was a feeling of vindication so strong it almost hurt. But Frank wasn't done. His ego was a fortress built on denial, and he wasn't going to let facts breach the walls. Oh, hogwash, Frank sputtered, dismissing the General's defense with a wave of his hand. That's just the military talking, making everything sound heroic. At the end of the day, she's sitting in a chair. My neighbor, Jimmy. The plumber? He's on his knees in raw sewage at 3 a.m. fixing a pipe so a family can have water. That is heroic. That is real. This is just theory. It's book smarts. And book smarts don't mean a damn thing when the real world comes knocking. The real world is exactly where we are, Frank, the General snapped. No, we're not, Frank argued, his voice slurring slightly from the wine he claimed to hate. We're in a bubble, a fancy $13 million bubble, and my daughter is just the girl playing pretend pilot at the front of it. She's lucky she has that computer to fly the plane for her, or we'd probably be in a cornfield by now. That was it. The accusation that I was incompetent, that I was lucky, that I was a fraud relying on automation. It was the final insult. It wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on the integrity of my profession. I looked at the altimeter. We were beginning our initial descent into the Teterboro approach corridor. I needed to brief the passengers, but more importantly, I needed to end this. I reached out and disengaged the autopilot. The plane shifted slightly, responding instantly to my touch. The hum of the engines changed pitch as I pulled back the throttles. The artificial smoothness of the computer was replaced by the subtle, living vibration of the aircraft under manual control. "Luis," I said, my voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel that made him sit up straighter. "You have the controls." "I have the controls," Luis repeated automatically, his hands going to the yoke. "Captain?" I unbuckled my harness. The metal clasp clicked open. "Maintain flight level 300, I ordered. "Keep her steady. I have to go handle a disturbance in the cabin." "Understood," Luis said, keeping his eyes forward, though I saw a flicker of grim satisfaction on his face. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the cockpit window. The tired girl from the bedroom was gone. The daughter who wanted approval was gone. I turned to the cockpit door, the barrier that had separated my world from his. I reached for the handle. Frank wanted real. He wanted to know what happened outside the bubble. I was about to show him. I stepped out of the flight deck and pulled the heavy, reinforced door shut behind me until it locked with a solid, mechanical thud. The transition was instant. The focused, rhythmic hum of the cockpit instruments was replaced by the hushed, pressurized silence of the main cabin. I stood there for a moment in the small galley area, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. My heart was pounding, not from the flight, but from the anticipation of what I was about to walk into. I could hear him before I saw him. Frank's voice was louder now, booming off the hand-polished mahogany paneling. He was clearly halfway through the bottle of Camus, and the alcohol had stripped away whatever thin veneer of social filter he had left. "It's a lease, General. That's how they do it," Frank was saying, his voice thick with unearned confidence. "It's all smoke and mirrors. She rents this thing by the hour to impress people like you. It's a tax write-off for some big corporation in New York, and they just let her play captain. She's a driver. That's it. A glorified bus driver in a fancy suit." I stepped into the aisle. The scene before me was like a tableau of a disaster in slow motion. Frank was sprawled in the cream-colored leather seat, one leg crossed over the other, his work boot resting dangerously close to the walnut veneer of the side table. He was holding the crystal wine glass by the bowl, his grip clumsy and aggressive. General Ellison was sitting opposite him. But the general wasn't drinking. He was staring at Frank with the kind of intense predatory focus usually reserved for enemy combatants. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. Frank didn't see me yet. He was too busy tearing me down to notice the subject of his scorn had arrived. "I mean, look at her," Frank chuckled, swirling the wine violently. "She can't even afford a real house. She rents an apartment near the city. If she was really running things, wouldn't she have a mansion? No, it's all a front. She's just..." "Mr. Bailey." The general's voice wasn't loud, but it stopped Frank mid-sentence. It was a command. General Ellison unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic click echoed in the small space like a gunshot. He stood up. In the confined space of the fuselage, he loomed over my father. The general was a man who had commanded fleets, who had sent men into battle, and who carried an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. Frank looked up, blinking. For the first time, he looked unsure. "I'm just telling you the truth, General. I'm trying to save you from being scammed by a girl who..." "You are not telling me the truth," General Ellison interrupted, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "You are telling me your insecurities. And quite frankly, I have heard enough." I took a step forward, but the general raised a hand, signaling me to stop. He wasn't done. He turned his full attention back to Frank. "You seem to be laboring under a massive delusion, Mr. Bailey," the general said, enunciating every word with surgical precision. "You keep referring to Alicia as an employee. You keep calling this aircraft a rental. You keep implying she is working for some invisible corporation." The general took a step closer, leaning down so his face was level with Frank's. "Let me correct the record for you, once and for all. Alicia Bailey does not work for a corporation. She is the corporation." Frank frowned, his brow furrowing. What? This aircraft, the general gestured to the cabin around them. This Learjet 75 Liberty, serial number 045, is not leased. It is not rented. It is an asset fully owned by Bailey Aero Logistics. And do you know who the sole proprietor of Bailey Aero Logistics is? Frank's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. It is the woman standing behind you, the general said, pointing a finger at me without looking away from Frank. Your daughter signed the check for this plane, $13 million, paid for by contracts she negotiated, flights she piloted, and a reputation she built from scratch. Frank turned his head slowly. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, glassy, and confused. He was looking for the lie. He was looking for the trick. But I just stood there. I didn't shrink. I didn't look down. I stood with my feet shoulder-width apart, my hands relaxed at my sides, wearing the suit he had mocked, standing in the plane he had kicked. That's not possible, Frank stammered, his voice weak. She fixes bicycles. She loses keys. She employs 50 people, Mr. Bailey, the general continued, hammering the final nails into the coffin of Frank's ego. 50 families rely on her for their mortgages, their health care, and their food, including me. Frank looked back at the general. You? I am retired from the military, General Ellison said. I work as a strategic consultant now, which means, Mr. Bailey, that when I step onto this aircraft, your daughter is my boss. She signs my paycheck, and it is a very substantial paycheck. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the engines seemed to fade away. The air in the cabin felt thin, electric. She is a self-made millionaire, the general whispered, delivering the final blow. While you have spent the last hour sitting in her chair, drinking her wine, and disrespecting her name, she has been up there piloting us safely through the sky, carrying the weight of an empire on her shoulders. Frank sat frozen. The information hit him like a physical blow. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving it sallow and gray under the cabin lights. The narrative he had built his entire life, the story where he was the strong provider and I was the weak, dependent child, didn't just crack. It disintegrated. He looked down at his hands, the hands he was so proud of, the hands he claimed were the only ones that did real work. They looked old now. They looked dirty against the pristine leather. He looked at me again. But this time, he didn't see a little girl. He saw a stranger. He saw a titan. He saw someone who had surpassed him so completely that he couldn't even comprehend the distance between us. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was the smallest person in the room. His right hand, the one holding the crystal flute of Cabernet, began to tremble. It started as a small twitch, then grew into a violent shake. The wine rippled in the glass, a dark red storm. He tried to grip it tighter, tried to regain control, but his nerves failed him. His reality failed him. The glass slipped. It happened in slow motion. I watched the crystal flute tumble from his grease-stained fingers. It rotated once in the air, catching the sunlight streaming through the oval window, looking beautiful and fragile. It hit the hard edge of the table base before landing on the floor. Smash. The sound was explosive. It was sharp, violent, and final. The crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The dark red wine exploded outward, staining the beige carpet like a fresh wound, splashing onto Frank's worn-out work boots. Frank didn't move to pick it up. He didn't apologize. He just stared at the broken glass, his mouth hanging open, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The arrogance was gone. The bluster was gone. All that was left was a pile of broken glass and a man who finally understood that he had lost. I looked at the mess on the floor. Then I looked at my father. Luis, I said into the intercom, my voice calm and echoing through the silent cabin. We have a spill in the cabin. Maintain course. I'll handle the cleanup. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. The sound of that glass breaking said everything I had ever wanted to say. The descent into Norfolk was smoother than the drive to the airfield had been in my father's truck. The Learjet 75 Liberty kissed the runway at Norfolk International with barely a shudder, the reverse thrusters roaring to life to slow our momentum. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. Since the moment the crystal glass had shattered on the floor, Frank Bailey hadn't spoken a single word. He sat strapped in his leather seat, staring out the oval window at the passing tarmac, his face pale and slack. He looked like a man who had walked into a room he thought he owned, only to realize he was standing in a stranger's house. I taxied the aircraft to the private FBO terminal. The engines whined down into silence. "We're here," I said over the intercom. My voice was tired. I opened the main cabin door. The humid, salty air of coastal Virginia rushed in, mixing with the smell of jet fuel. General Ellison unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He glanced at Frank, who was moving slowly, his movements heavy and arthritic. "After you, Mr. Bailey," the general said. It wasn't a courtesy, it was a way to ensure Frank actually kept moving. Frank stood up. He avoided looking at the stain on the carpet where the wine had spilled. He avoided looking at the general. And he definitely avoided looking at me as I emerged from the cockpit. He walked down the air stairs like a man marching to the gallows, his eyes fixed on the gray concrete below. We walked across the apron toward the glass doors of the private terminal. The wind was picking up, tugging at the hem of my blazer. I walked a few paces behind Frank, watching his hunched shoulders. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt empty. Just as we reached the terminal entrance, the automatic doors slid open. "Miss Alicia! Miss Alicia!" A high-pitched voice pierced the heavy silence. A small blur of pink and denim shot out of the building, bypassing the reception desk and the security guard who smiled as she ran past. It was Ruthie. She was 7 years old, with hair as thin as corn silk and skin that was still recovering its color. She was wearing a thick winter coat that seemed too big for her fragile frame. She didn't stop. She ran straight at me, hitting me with the force of a cannonball. I dropped my flight bag just in time to catch her, dropping to one knee to wrap my arms around her. "Whoa there, speed racer," I laughed, the first genuine smile of the day breaking across my face. "You're supposed to be resting." "I made you something," Ruthie squealed, pulling back. She was clutching a piece of wrinkled yellow construction paper. "Mom said you were coming, so I drew it. Look." I took the paper. It was a crayon drawing, the kind that smells of wax and childhood. In the center was a crude, lopsided white airplane. Next to it was a stick figure with long blonde hair wearing a blue suit. Above the figure, in uneven, blocky letters, she had written, "Superhero." "It's beautiful, Ruthie," I whispered, my throat tightening. "It's you," she said seriously, pointing a small finger at the stick figure. "Because you fly the rocket ship." Ruthie's mother, a tired-looking woman named Sarah, came hurrying out of the terminal. She had tears in her eyes as she looked at me. She mouthed a silent "thank you" before gently placing a hand on Ruthie's shoulder. I stood up, holding Ruthie's hand. I looked up and saw Frank. He was standing 10 feet away, frozen. He was staring at the little girl. He looked confused, disoriented. This didn't fit into his narrative. This wasn't a corporate boardroom. This wasn't a game. General Ellison stepped up beside Frank. He didn't look at Frank. He looked at Ruthie. "You see that little girl, Mr. Bailey?" the general asked quietly. His voice was low, stripped of the anger from the flight, replaced by something somber. Frank didn't answer. He just nodded slightly. "Last week," the general continued, "a massive nor'easter system slammed into the East Coast. Winds were gusting at 60 knots. Visibility was 0. Commercial airlines canceled 3,000 flights. Even the medevac helicopters were grounded. It was a no-fly situation." Frank turned his head slowly to listen, his eyes still locked on Ruthie. "That little girl was in a hospital in Boston," the general said. "She was in heart failure. They found a donor heart here in Norfolk, but they had a 4-hour window to get the organ to the patient, or the heart would expire. And the girl would die." I saw Frank swallow hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "No one would fly," the general said. "It was suicide. The turbulence alone was enough to tear a lesser airframe apart. But the hospital called Alicia." The general turned to face Frank. Your daughter didn't call a corporate office for permission. She didn't check a profit margin. She got out of bed at 2 a.m., drove to the hangar, and fired up that jet. She flew solo into the teeth of a storm that frightened veteran combat pilots. She crabbed that jet into a crosswind landing that was nothing short of miraculous. Frank looked at me. I was busy listening to Ruthie talk about her new kitten, brushing a stray hair out of the girl's face. She delivered the heart with 20 minutes to spare, the general whispered. And when the hospital asked where to send the bill for the fuel and the flight time, which was about $40,000, Alicia tore up the invoice. She did it pro bono, the general said, using the Latin term that sounded foreign to a factory floor, but the meaning was clear. She did it for free, because she could, because that is what she uses her toys for. Frank stood there, the wind whipping his thinning hair. He looked at the crayon drawing in my hand. Superhero. Then he looked at my hands. They were resting on Ruthie's shoulder. They were smooth. They were manicured. They were the hands he had mocked for being soft. The hands he said had never done a hard day's work. The hands he claimed were useless because they weren't stained with grease or calloused by steel. He looked down at his own hands. They were thick, scarred, and permanently etched with the black grime of the machine shop. For 40 years, he had told himself that these hands made the world go round. He had told himself that because he made physical objects, gears, bolts, molds, he was the creator. But looking at Ruthie, alive and breathing, jumping up and down in her pink coat, Frank realized the terrifying truth. His hands had made things. My hands had saved a life. His real work resulted in cold metal. My fake job resulted in a beating heart. The realization hit him harder than the breaking glass. It shattered the last defensive wall he had built around his heart. His chin began to tremble. His chest heaved with a sudden sharp intake of breath. "Oh, God!" Frank choked out. It was a ragged, wet sound. He took a step toward me, but his legs gave out. He didn't fall, but he crumbled, dropping to one knee on the hard concrete of the apron. "Dad!" I turned, startled. Frank didn't look up. He covered his face with his rough, grease-stained hands. And right there, under the roar of a departing cargo plane, in front of the general, the security guards, and the little girl I had saved, my father broke. He wept. It wasn't a silent cry. It was the deep, guttural sobbing of a man who was mourning the loss of his own ego. He cried for the years he had wasted being jealous. He cried for the cruelty he had inflicted. He cried because he finally saw the truth, and the brightness of it was blinding him. "I didn't know," he sobbed into his hands, his voice muffled and broken. "I didn't know." Ruthie stopped talking. She looked at the old man crying on the ground, then looked up at me with wide eyes. "Is he okay?" she whispered. I looked at my father, a man I had feared and sought approval from my entire life, now reduced to a weeping figure on the tarmac. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel the need to say, "I told you so." I just felt a heavy, profound relief. The war was over. The general had fired the final shot, and the enemy, my father's prejudice, had finally surrendered. I handed Ruthie's drawing to her mother and walked over to him. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting him cry, letting the tears wash away 40 years of grease and stubbornness. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the main hangar of Bailey Aero Logistics was humming with controlled chaos. A pallet of medical supplies was being loaded onto a turboprop for a short-haul flight to Pittsburgh, and the sound of forklifts beeping echoed off the high metal ceiling. I stood on the catwalk overlooking the floor, holding a clipboard, but my eyes weren't on the cargo. They were on the man standing by the loading bay doors. Frank Bailey was arguing with a delivery driver. But it wasn't the kind of argument I was used to. He wasn't shouting about politics or the decline of American manufacturing. He was holding a digital scanner in one hand and pointing at a shipping label with the other. "I don't care what your dispatch said, pal." Frank's voice carried up to me, firm and authoritative. "This crate contains temperature-sensitive vaccines. You don't leave it on the dock in the sun. You move it to the climate-controlled holding area. Now." The driver, a burly guy who looked like he could bench press a Buick, hesitated. He looked at the white embroidery on Frank's navy blue polo shirt. It read, Bailey Aero Logistics, Ground Security Manager. All right, old-timer, the driver muttered, moving the crate. That's Mr. Bailey to you, Frank corrected him, checking the item off his digital list. And tuck your shirt in. You're representing a professional operation here. I smiled, shaking my head. Frank had sold the Ford F-150 3 days ago. He said the suspension was shot and the gas mileage was offensive. But I knew the truth. He sold it because he didn't need to cling to the past anymore. He drove a sensible, company-issued SUV now. He showed up at the hangar at 6 a.m. every morning, 45 minutes before his shift started, checking perimeter fences and inspecting the landing gear of every bird on the apron. He was annoying, meticulous, and stubborn. And he was the best employee I'd ever hired. That evening, Frank knocked on my office door. Shift's over, boss, he said. He still called me boss, but the sarcasm was gone. Now, it sounded like a title. Get your coat, we're going out. Dad, I have paperwork. Paperwork can wait, it's Friday. And I promised the boys at the VFW I'd bring you by. My stomach tightened instinctively. The VFW, the scene of the crime, the smell of stale beer and humiliation. Do we have to? I asked. Yeah, Frank said, his eyes serious. We have to. We took his car. The drive was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, not the loaded, weaponized silence of 2 weeks ago. When we pulled into the gravel lot of VFW Post 1031, my heart rate spiked. We walked in. The smell was exactly the same. Old hops, floor wax, and memories. The same George Jones song was playing on the jukebox. The same group of men, Rusty, Old Miller, and the rest, were huddled around the high-top table. When they saw us, conversation stopped. Rusty looked at me, then at Frank, a smirk forming on his lips, ready to launch a joke about flying taxis. Frank didn't give him the chance. He walked right up to the table, placing a heavy hand on Rusty's shoulder. He didn't sit down. He stood tall, his chest puffed out, displaying the company logo on his polo shirt like it was a medal of honor. Gentlemen, Frank announced, his voice booming through the bar, cutting through the music. I want you to meet someone. Again. He stepped aside and gestured to me with an open hand, a gesture of presentation, of respect. This is Alicia Bailey, Frank said. She is the CEO and sole owner of Bailey Aero Logistics. She signs the paychecks for 50 families. She flies $13 million jets through storms that would make you wet your pants, Rusty. Rusty's smirk vanished. Old Miller choked on his beer. And, Frank continued, his voice catching slightly before becoming steel. She is my boss. And she is my daughter. He looked around the circle, making eye contact with every single man who had laughed at me 2 weeks ago. His gaze was a challenge. It was a line in the sand. Now, Frank said, leaning in, if anyone has any more jokes about playing pretend or fake jobs, step outside and talk to me. Because the only thing fake at this table is your understanding of what hard work looks like. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. Then Old Miller cleared his throat. He looked at me, then at my suit, then at Frank's fierce expression. He lifted his glass. To the CEO, Miller mumbled. To the CEO, the others echoed, subdued and respectful. Frank nodded, satisfied. Damn right. We didn't stay for a drink. Frank said he had an early shift tomorrow and couldn't be groggy. As we walked back to the car, the night air felt different. It wasn't cold and biting anymore. It felt fresh. Here, Frank said, stopping by the car door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in newspaper. I made this in the shop, in the garage, since, I'm good with my hands. I took the package. It was heavy. I peeled back the paper. It was a perfect cube of clear, polished epoxy resin. It was seamless, looking like a block of frozen water. Suspended in the absolute center of the cube, floating as if by magic, was a single, jagged shard of crystal. I recognized it immediately. It was a piece of the champagne flute that had shattered on the floor of the Learjet. the glass that had broken when his ego died. The shard caught the light from the street lamp, glittering like a diamond. It was sharp, dangerous, and beautiful. I turned the cube over. On the bottom, etched into the hardened resin in Frank's familiar, blocky handwriting, were words that made my breath catch in my throat. When the ego shatters, love has room to take flight. I looked up at him. Frank was looking at his shoes, scuffing the gravel, embarrassed by his own sentimentality. I picked it up, he mumbled. After you went to the cockpit, I cleaned up the mess. I saved a piece, to remind me. To remind you of what? I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up, his eyes wet. To remind me that I was wrong, and to remind me that the most important thing I ever built wasn't a steel mold or an engine part. He reached out and touched my shoulder. It was you, Ali. You're the best work I ever did. I looked at the block in my hand, a piece of broken violence transformed into a permanent piece of art. I looked at the man standing before me, wearing my company's logo, finally seeing me for the first time. I smiled, and I felt 34 years of weight lift off my shoulders. I looked up at the night sky above Ohio. Somewhere up there, a plane was crossing the dark expanse, navigating by instruments, trusting the laws of physics. Come on, ground security manager, I said, opening the car door. We have an early start tomorrow. Frank smiled, a real smile this time. Copy that, Captain. I had spent my life searching for a real job to impress him. But in the end, I realized the only job that mattered was the one I had just finished. I had helped my father find his way home. And the view from here was absolutely clear. That wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for every black sheep who dared to build a life their family didn't understand. If you are still waiting for that apology, or waiting for someone to see your worth, I want you to stop waiting. Go out there and build your own empire, whether it's in a cockpit, a garage, or a kitchen. You define your value. If Frank Bailey's turnaround gave you hope, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. And do me one last favor. Drop a comment below saying, I am the captain. Let the world know that from today on, you are in command of your own destiny.